Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre says that a future conservative government would change the law to require that porn websites verify the age of users to prevent minors from accessing the content. The Tories currently back a Senate bill that promises to do just that. Bill S-210, passed in the Senate in the spring, is set to be studied by a House of Commons committee, but no scheduled meetings have been put on the books yet. The law would require adult websites to verify users' ages, but doesn't specify how exactly that would be done, and that is where much of the debate lies. Options have included a digital ID system or services that can estimate age based on the scan of a user's face. Joining us now to discuss the debate over age verification for porn websites is Anthony Koch, principal at AK Strategies and former spokesman for Pierre Poilievre. Anthony, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So this has sparked quite a debate. What is your view on the bill or the concept of age verification for these websites?
I think it makes perfect sense. I mean, we have these sorts of things not only online. Obviously, it's very different online than when it is in person, but gambling websites, even something as simple as Uber Eats, once they permitted the purchase of alcohol, required proving identification in order to show that you were over the age required to purchase alcohol. So this is something that we do in other facets of our society. There's all sorts of online ID verification that goes on for all sorts of different things. I guess, again, the devil is in the details, but I don't see why, and this was something that I found very interesting in a lot of the conversations surrounding on this, some people seem so very passionate about minors being able to have access to, in many cases, extremely aggressive and violent pornography.
So a follow up there, because I actually don't know, are there people making the argument that minors should actually have access to this? Because one would think that most people understand that this is adult content. It's not for minors, but their concerns to these proposals come from things like the privacy rights of adults in terms of age verification. What do you make of those concerns in terms of age verification, having to, let's say, have software scan your face, or having to actually input your identification, which is fundamentally different than, let's say, going to a liquor store and having someone just visually look at your identification and hand it back to you?
No, absolutely. And this is one area where I think the devil is in the details. I mean, we've seen even in the last few years, there was that massive data leak from Ashley Madison, stuff like that. So there is a very big difference. You're correct. If I have an ID card and I walk into the liquor store and I flash it, somebody verifies it quickly, and then I go buy my booze, there's no database, there's no storage of that information and any sort of thing that could be hacked or leaked. That's not the case for online sort of stuff. So I am sympathetic, especially in light of some of the policies and some of the things that we've all been forced to endure over the course of the last few years in terms of privacy violation, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a lot of the people who are proposing or supporting this sort of legislation would do, myself included in many instances, a better job in validating some of these concerns. And I think that they're legitimate, but that's why, again, this is very preliminary. This is why there's a process to these sorts of things. And a lot of technology is coming out right now, especially even in the crypto space, for example, where you can engage in third-party identity verification without it being stored anywhere and without the possibility for these sorts of leaks to happen. So again, devil's in the detail. Obviously, you don't want shady porn sites to be storing extremely personal details about people on servers that are very subject to attack. And then all of a sudden, that's leverage to be used against people. And I understand some of the concerns people have about digital ID, but specifically as it applies to Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party and the policy that they're proposing, it's been established from the very beginning, Mr. Poilievre is opposed 150% to a digital ID. That includes in the case of this specific policy. So anybody who's concerned about that, I think those fears are legitimate and that people should be understanding of them. But it's also important to focus on the facts about what's being proposed here, some of the technology that's available already. In fact, this is already replicated in other instances in our society, and that Mr. Poilievre and the Conservative Party has been extraordinarily clear that this is not a backdoor digital ID and that we stand firmly against it.
What about the argument that parents can simply just put content filters on their computers, on what's used at home, on a child's device, like they would Netflix? Is that not a solution here?
I mean, like in theory, but this notion that parents can be so intimately involved in to this extent, like kids are going to find workarounds. That's what we've all done. I know I did it. I know you did. Maybe not necessarily in this context, but the idea that parents can have 150% control and trying to throw this on parents as if their children are accessing pornography, it's some sort of failure of them individually because they're not sufficiently. I think that's ridiculous. It's so easy to access.
We're back with Anthony Koch talking about the debate over age verification for porn websites. Anthony, before the break, you were talking about the balance between deferring to parents, things like content blockers on devices. And you mentioned that there are workarounds. And children, once they get to a certain age, obviously can be creative in terms of the types of content that they would want to access. Could that be an argument against age verification in terms of minors finding ways to access content that they want outside of whatever system ends up getting implemented?
So obviously, if someone's dedicated enough, you can find ways to do all sorts of things. I mean, at the end of the day, right, we have age restrictions on stuff like alcohol consumption and
Mm-hmm.
gambling. If people can find workarounds around like that, I mean, kids consume alcohol all the time, find ways to work around the system. Is that an argument in favor of removing any and all age restrictions for
Mm-hmm.
purchase of alcohol? No, people are still going to find a way to do things that are illegal. That's why, there's criminal justice system among many other things. But this is about creating an additional barrier to, at the very least, significantly reduce the consumption and make it more difficult. Okay, we're not illusioned about the things about that are going on here. At the end of the day, like we said, yes, there are workarounds. The same workarounds that children can use in some cases to subvert the parental controls of their parents are in many instances the same ones that they'd use, I
Yep.
suppose, to circumvent some of these restrictions that the government wants to put in place.
Yep.
But I think the argument about the effectiveness of the measure is more interesting in some respects and more valid than concerns about whether or not the interest in proposing this kind of legislation to protect children is valid or invalid.
Yeah, and what's the root of the debate happening now? Is there something that has happened in society that's pushed this debate to the forefront where minors having access is, let's say, becoming more of a problem? How did we get to having this debate now?
I think you see there's some shocking stats that you can search up coming out of the United Kingdom because they've been most diligent on this relative to other countries. But
Hmm.
sexual violence in minors has surged. Okay. And I don't want to be one of those people. We don't want to go back to the days where people were talking about those damn violent video games. But the point being, the culture around sex has changed immensely over the course of the last few decades. In some cases, many positive ways, and in others, I think more negative. And I don't think it's healthy or good for the first real sexual experience, if you will, of in particular young men to be some of these extraordinarily aggressive, unrealistic, and quite frankly, in some instances, misogynistic instances
Hmm.
of porn that then lead to all sorts of assumptions about what a sexual relationship actually looks like, which leads to
Yeah.
women also being expected to sort of fulfill these weird fantasies that are not really healthy or natural or naturally occurring in the real world. And I think, it doesn't take much to look around the world and say, people are a little bit different in that domain and probably not always in ways that are particularly healthy. And I think that this is one of the number one ways that it starts.
And you mentioned the UK and the research out of the UK. Have they established any type of causal link between that societal change that you mentioned and exposure to adult content? Because obviously that is the crux of the debate on in terms of regulating.
So many experts have come out and suggested that there's a desensitization process that's going on, in particular, like again, in extremely violent forms of porn that have been normalized.
Hmm.
And it just leads to things that, in a normal society where this kind of exposure doesn't happen at an extraordinarily young age and is not considered normal, people would find outrageous and horrendous at face value,
Hmm.
but now seems kind of sort of normal or whatever. So again, it's definitely more complicated than this. And I'm not
Yeah.
suggesting that, porn consumption is this all evil thing that will result in people becoming rapists. I'm not trying to advance that
Yeah.
argument any stretch of the imagination. I just think we can understand the impacts that these sorts of imagery have on developing men, in particular young males.
Yeah.
And understand that this is adult content. It's labeled as such. It's called as
Yeah.
such. That's
Of
what it
course.
is. Why? Because it's for adults and not for children.
One last thing. We have about 40 seconds here. Prime Minister Trudeau had thrown a couple jabs at Pierre Poilievre over this, while at the same time bringing forward an online harms bill to
Yeah.
protect minors. Is there a discrepancy there, and can you help us explain it? We don't have too much time, but I'll leave it with
No,
you.
it's just a classic case of political trolling. I mean, you see Justin Trudeau now saying that Pierre Poilievre's proposing digital ID, even though I'm
Hmm.
sure he and his government would love to do something similar along those lines. So I think it's really as simple as that. It's a political trolling. I wouldn't read into it more than that.
Anthony, thank you very much for your time today.
Of course, thank you.